August 1st, 1943. 5:10 in the morning. Benghazi airfield, Libya. The desert still holds the chill of night. The horizon bleeds from indigo to pale gold. Rows of silver B-24 Liberators stand wingtip to wingtip, their fuselages glimmering under floodlights. Ground crews move in silence, some tightening fuel caps, others checking bomb racks. Their breath turns white in the dawn. Each bomber bears a name, scrawled in black paint. The Sandman, Kickapoo, Wongo Wongo. Small rituals before a giant gamble. Engines cough awake, one after another, until the airfield trembles under a rolling thunder. Dust swirls, tents shudder, wrenches fall to the ground. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant James Merrick slides a photo of his wife behind the compass. Next to him, Sergeant Ed Bowles checks the radio and mutters, "All this way for a few oil tanks." The mission brief had been simple. Fly 1,700 miles, hit the refineries at Ploiești, and cripple Hitler's fuel. They were told surprise was their greatest weapon. They were not told the Germans had turned the city into a fortress of flak. The first formation lumbers down the runway. 65,000 pounds of steel, fuel, and hope. Propeller wash tears at the sandbags, and a trail of dust follows each rising bomber into the pink sky. The last thing the men see on the ground are the mechanics waving, and the last thing the mechanics hear is the fading growl of 1,200 engines heading east. They believe they're about to change the course of the war. But beyond the Balkans, black towers of smoke already rise over Ploiești, and none of them know they're flying into the deadliest ambush of the air campaign. He didn't know this morning would rewrite everything. Before the smoke of battle, there was oil. Black, heavy, indispensable. By 1943, nearly 1/3 of Germany's entire fuel supply came from a single patch of land in Romania, the oil fields and refineries of Ploiești. From these pipelines flowed the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine. Gasoline for the Luftwaffe, diesel for the Panzer divisions, and lubricants for the U-boats prowling the Atlantic. Every Messerschmitt, every Tiger tank, every truck that rolled east or west owed its fire to this city of steel and smoke. To Berlin, Ploiești was sacred, a fortress of production wrapped in layers of illusion and arrogance. German analysts called it der unantastbare Punkt, the untouchable point. Their reasoning seemed sound. Ploiești sat nearly 1,700 miles from the nearest Allied base in Libya, far beyond the comfortable reach of any bomber. It was shielded by the Carpathian Mountains, defended by 300 anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and decoy sites. And the Luftwaffe's field reports concluded, quote, "No bomber could reach Ploiești and return." To Hitler, that was enough. He saw the city not as a target, but as a proof of German invincibility. A beating heart no enemy would ever dare touch. But on the opposite side of the Mediterranean, American planners thought otherwise. Inside a tent near Benghazi, maps stretched across wooden tables. Colored pencils traced an impossible idea. What if they flew under the radar? Not at 20,000 feet, but at 200. The man behind the plan, Colonel Jacob Smart, believed that precision could replace altitude. His concept was bold. Launch 5 bomb groups of B-24 Liberators from Libya. Fly low across the Mediterranean. Slip through the mountains of Yugoslavia. Then strike the refineries in a single synchronized wave. Each bomber would hug the terrain, using rivers and railways as guides. There would be no fighter escort, no radar support, no second chance. General Uzal Ent, commander of the 9th Air Force, signed off with a single line in his journal. If it works, it will shorten the war. If it fails, we may never try again. The operation was codenamed Tidal Wave. Its promise, to drown Hitler's fuel supply in fire. And yet, beneath the optimism, cracks were already showing. Navigation training had been rushed. Maps were incomplete. Radio frequencies were inconsistent. Even the route, threading between neutral and Axis airspace, demanded flawless timing. Still, In July 1943, hundreds of ground crew painted black stripes under each Liberator's wings to help formation recognition at low level. In the heat of the desert, mechanics worked through the night, checking fuel lines, trimming weight, and whispering prayers. At the same time, in Romania, German engineers stood on refinery roofs, confident that distance and flak would keep them safe. A Romanian officer watching the horizon joked, "If they ever come, we'll see them before we hear them." He had no idea how wrong he was. The American plan depended on surprise, but surprise has a heartbeat, and every heartbeat echoes. Word of an upcoming raid began to leak through radio intercepts and informants. By late July, the Germans had quietly reinforced the defenses of Ploiești, doubling the number of guns and camouflaging the refineries with painted rooftops that mimicked farmland. Still, to the Allied crews, the mission briefing felt almost poetic. One map caption read, "Through courage and precision, we shall strike the black heart of the Axis." It sounded like destiny. But destiny, like oil, burns easily. The enemy believed the sky itself was their shield. They were about to learn. It was only air. At 8 a.m., the first Liberators crossed the ridges of the Carpathian Mountains. The sun climbed behind them, throwing long shadows across fields of wheat and small villages still half asleep. From their cockpits, the crews could see farmers looking up, children running into the streets, waving. For a heartbeat, the Americans thought the people were cheering them on. They didn't know those same hands would point moments later toward the sky, guiding the gunners. The B-24s flew so low, their propellers clipped the tops of trees. Maps unfolded on knees, rivers became their only compass. Inside, the Sandman, Lieutenant James Merrick adjusted his course by a church steeple glinting in the morning light. At that height, every window, every rooftop flashed by like a mirror. Then came the first puff of smoke, small, white, harmless, rising from the ground ahead. Seconds later, the horizon erupted. Black flak bursts opened like flowers of fire. The crews had expected scattered resistance, not this wall of steel. Shells exploded at eye level. Shards tore through fuselages. Oxygen masks swung wildly in the turbulence. Someone on the intercom shouted, "We're too low, too damn low." Ploiești was no sleeping target. The Germans had built gun nests into factory chimneys, disguised batteries in haystacks, even mounted cannons on water towers. The entire city was awake and waiting. As the bombers descended over the refinery district, the ground itself seemed alive. Pipelines burst under strafing fire, releasing geysers of crude that caught flame midair. Columns of fire reached hundreds of feet high, painting the sky orange and black. The heat was so fierce that aluminum skins warped. Paint blistered off in seconds. Inside Wongo, Sergeant Ed Bowles gripped the twin .50 caliber guns until his hands bled. He could see another Liberator just ahead. Its right wing sheared off, spiraling into a field already burning. Radio chatter dissolved into chaos. "Blue 3, you're off course." "God, there's smoke everywhere. I can't see the target." "Kickapoo hit. She's going down." Through the inferno, pilots dropped their bombs almost by instinct, skimming rooftops at 200 feet. Oil tanks exploded like volcanoes, sending shockwaves that flipped jeeps and shattered factory windows miles away. The city of Ploiești, once called the Pearl of Romania, now glowed like a furnace. Lieutenant Merrick would later write in his diary, "It looked like hell had been turned upside down." Over the burning maze of refineries, the formations began to scatter. Smoke rose higher than the bombers themselves, swallowing the sun. Pilots lost sight of their leaders. Compass needles spun uselessly in the turbulence. Major John Kane's group, meant to strike the Astra Romana refinery, veered north too early. They came in over the wrong sector, a web of oil tanks and rail yards. The Germans below, realizing the miscalculation, unleashed every gun they had. Tracer fire stitched through the sky like fiery handwriting. One burst caught the Duchess square in the bomb bay. She vanished in a single flash. 50,000 pounds of fuel and explosives gone in a heartbeat. Lieutenant Merrick's crew flew through the shockwave, their windshield cracking like ice. The smell of gasoline flooded the cockpit. "We've lost hydraulics," someone shouted, but there was no time to think. Everywhere, aircraft peeled off, banking through clouds of fire and debris. Some dropped bombs blind. Others tried to circle for another run, and found only chaos waiting. Below them, trains exploded one by one, their tank cars erupting like dominoes of flame. The heat turned the air itself into a living thing. Shimmering, violent, impossible to breathe. Crewman Robert Hayes later recalled, "You couldn't tell what was ground and what was sky. Everything burned the same color." By mid-morning, the city of Ploiești was a single inferno. The roar of engines mixed with the thunder of collapsing towers. A church bell somewhere rang inwardly, echoing between the detonations. Parachutes bloomed, some on fire before they opened. In the Sandman, Merrick pulled up to clear a chimney. The blast from below lifted his tail and slammed the plane sideways. He saw, just for an instant, the black cross of a German flak tower looming through the smoke. Then it vanished in flame. Behind him, the radio operator screamed into the mic, "They're hitting from every angle! God, we're over the wrong city block!" And that was when the truth finally sank in. The maps, carefully drawn from aerial photos and old reconnaissance, had been off by miles. The landmarks they'd used for navigation, the railroad spur, the water tower, the refinery layout, all mirrored other sectors of the city. Half the force was bombing targets never meant to be touched. A formation leader tried to correct course, banking toward the real target zone. German fighters dove from the clouds, pouncing on the stragglers. 2 more Liberators went down in flames before the rest could escape the trap. For many, there was no escape at all. Those who turned south found the return route blocked by the very smoke they'd created. Engines overheated, gauges failed, propellers coughed black oil. Some limped out over the Danube, dropping altitude until treetops brushed their bellies. Others never made it that far. A handful of B-24s crash-landed in fields, their crews crawling from the wreckage. Faces blackened, uniforms in tatters. Romanian villagers rushed to help, unaware that rescue now meant capture. In the distance, the city still burned. A pillar of smoke rising 30,000 feet, visible from the Black Sea. "It looked like the end of the world," one pilot said. "And we were flying straight through the middle of it." By noon, what remained of the American formation turned west for home. Engines coughing, fuel nearly gone. Some would make it back to Benghazi after 13 hours in the air. Most would not. The men had come to strike at the heart of Hitler's empire. Instead, they found themselves bleeding over a city that should never have surprised them. But did. They realized their maps were wrong. The operation that became known as Tidal Wave was never meant to be graceful. It was arithmetic. Brutal, exact, and unforgiving. 177 B-24 Liberators, spread across 5 bomb groups, lined up wingtip to wingtip in the Libyan dawn. Each weighed 65,000 pounds loaded. Each carried 2,000 gallons of fuel and 5,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared with a strength of 1,200 horses apiece. On paper, the Liberator was a marvel. Faster than the British Lancaster, able to fly 2,000 miles and still come home. But paper has no flak, and math cannot feel fear. The plan called for a round trip of 1,700 miles. The altitude under 500 feet. So low that some commanders joked they would buzz the Danube. There would be no radar, no fighter escort, no weather reconnaissance. Navigation would rely on stopwatches, compasses, and the faint blue lines of rivers drawn from aerial photos. Their targets were drawn like organs on a surgeon's chart. Astra Romana, the largest refinery, Hitler's main artery of fuel. Columbia Aquila, chemical refining and high-octane output. Creditul Minier, storage and pipeline junctions. Steaua Romana, Romania's oldest refinery, and Unirea Speranta, a maze of tanks and rail lines. Each group had its target, its route, its timing. Every minute mattered. A 10-second delay could scatter the formation over half a mile. At 0800 hours, the first bombers left Benghazi. They crossed the Mediterranean, climbed briefly to clear the Greek coast, then dropped again to treetop level. In that thin line of aluminum and dust, the margin for error was smaller than the width of a wingtip. Somewhere over the mountains, a single misread bearing, just 10 degrees off, began to unravel the geometry. By the time they reached the plains of Romania, the lead navigator had already missed the initial checkpoint. The formation split like threads in wind. Courage was abundant, the after-action report would later read. Accuracy was not. Still, the numbers told their own story. 300 anti-aircraft guns per square mile surrounded Ploiești, twice the concentration found over Berlin. The Germans had ringed the city with radar-directed 88mm batteries, plus light flak mounted on trucks and factory roofs. Even the railway cars carried hidden cannons. When the first bomb struck, oil tanks erupted with the force of small earthquakes. Pressure valves burst. Storage domes flew into the air like coins. Flames leapt 300 feet high. The shock waves knocked bombers sideways, shredded control cables, and set engines ablaze. Inside the chaos, the human side of arithmetic began to unfold. Out of the 177 aircraft that took off, 88 would make it back. 53 would be lost entirely, shot down, crashed, or missing over the Balkans. Nearly 500 men were killed or captured. The operation had delivered 310 tons of bombs at a cost no equation could balance. For the crews who survived the inferno and limped home, the details came later, in numbers, blueprints, and cold engineering reports. Each B-24 Liberator was a compromise between power and fragility. At 65,000 pounds fully loaded, it was fast for its size, 290 miles an hour at cruising speed, but its long, thin wings made it unforgiving at low altitude. Below 500 feet, the slightest turbulence could snap a wing or shear a control surface. And that's where tidal wave lived, between the ground and the impossible. The engineers at Consolidated Aircraft had designed the Liberator for high-altitude bombing, but in Libya, mechanics stripped armor plating, removed turrets, and recalibrated fuel systems for range. They even taped over gun ports to save weight. Every gallon mattered. Each bomber consumed 2,000 gallons of high-octane fuel just to complete the journey. Enough to drive a modern car around the world twice. The flight plan itself was a feat of manual calculation. Colonel Jacob Smart's staff had mapped the route with a ruler, measuring each leg by hand. Libya to Corfu, then across Yugoslavia, then northeast to Ploiești. Every waypoint was timed to the second. A 10-degree deviation, less than the width of your fist on a map, meant disaster. It was navigation by faith, not instruments. Over the Balkans, many crews flew blind through morning haze, relying on the sun's angle and the shadows of rivers. Some never found their checkpoints. Inside the bomb bay, the mechanics of destruction were simple. Each bomber carried up to 10 1,000-pound bombs with delayed fuses, designed to ignite oil tanks seconds after impact, maximizing fire spread. But at such low altitude, the explosions caught the attackers themselves. Pilots had to yank their planes upward the moment the payload dropped, or be consumed by their own shock wave. One navigator later wrote, "We were flying through our own bombs." The Germans, for their part, had turned defense into mathematics as well. Around Ploiești, the Wehrmacht and Romanian army installed over 300 anti-aircraft guns per square mile, a density twice that of Berlin. They used overlapping fields of fire, controlled by radar and visual spotters. The gunners didn't need to aim. They just filled the sky with steel. When the Liberators arrived, the system worked perfectly. The first waves drew fire, the later ones flew into it. Each minute, 6,000 shells filled the air. The result wasn't a defense, it was a storm. And yet, despite the chaos, some strikes hit their mark with surgical precision. Astra Romana's central distillation tower was reduced to rubble. Storage fields burned for days. But other bombs fell wide, striking rail depots and civilian districts. What was meant to be a single coordinated blow had dissolved into dozens of isolated fights for survival. By the time the last formations turned home, the numbers began to settle like ash. Of 177 bombers launched, 88 returned to Benghazi. 18 crash-landed in friendly territory. 5 limped to neutral Turkey. More than 50 vanished. 500 men were dead or missing. The cost was staggering, the courage unquestionable. In a debrief written weeks later, General Uzal Ent concluded with a single line. "In the arithmetic of war, bravery cannot replace accuracy." When the smoke cleared over Romania, the numbers finally began to mean something. The industrial arithmetic of war, cold, simple, and cruel, could now be written on paper. Ploiești had burned for days. Allied reconnaissance photographs taken on August 2nd showed refineries still smoldering, black plumes stretching 40 miles into the sky. For that single morning of destruction, the U.S. Army Air Forces had dropped over 310 tons of bombs, more than 600,000 pounds of explosives. On the ground, dozens of storage tanks had ruptured. Astra Romana's catalytic towers lay in twisted heaps. The refinery Steaua Romana was reduced to a skeleton of steel. For several weeks, German fuel output dropped by nearly 1/3, but repairs began almost immediately. By September, production was nearly restored. The raid had cost Germany time. It had cost America blood. Out of 177 bombers launched, 88 returned. 53 were lost. Of those that came home, nearly everyone was damaged. Holes in wings, glass shattered, engines coughing black smoke. Many landed on fumes, one wheel down, hydraulic systems gone. 477 men were killed or missing. 220 were captured, some in Romania, others after crash landing in Yugoslavia or Bulgaria. It was, at that point, the heaviest single-day loss the U.S. Air Forces had ever endured. But to the men who flew it, tidal wave wasn't measured in aircraft or tonnage. It was measured in seconds. The seconds spent staring through the gun sight, the seconds between dropping the bombs and surviving the fireball. Back in Benghazi, the survivors gathered in silence near their hangars. Mechanics walked among the returning planes, counting holes instead of victories. One crew chief found a single bullet lodged in a pilot's seat, a half-inch from his spine. Another Liberator rolled to a stop with one engine dead and a prayer card taped to the dashboard. General Uzal Ent's final report read like an engineer's lament. The plan worked on the drafting table. The error lay in believing the drafting table could feel heat. Even the Germans, stunned by the scale of the assault, admitted the audacity. A Luftwaffe colonel wrote, "They came like ghosts, too low for our radar, too fast for our eyes." When historians compared the defensive firepower at Ploiești to other targets, they found the numbers staggering. Berlin, 150 anti-aircraft guns per square mile. Ploiești, more than 300. In effect, the Americans had attacked the most heavily defended point in Europe without escort, from an impossible range. It was an equation of courage against geometry. And yet, out of the ashes came legends. 5 medals of honor were awarded for the raid, the most ever for a single mission. Colonel John Kane, who led his group through the flames, refused evacuation after a crash landing. He was found days later, sitting by his wrecked Liberator, still clutching his flight map, the one that had been 10 degrees off. To the world, tidal wave became both triumph and tragedy, proof that American industry could reach anywhere, but also that even the finest machines depended on frail human eyes and hands. In the months that followed, the Air Forces abandoned low-level bombing for good. Future raids on Europe and Japan would be flown from 20,000 feet, guided by radar and escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang. Technology would replace instinct. Distance would replace daring. But for one August morning, over the oil fields of Romania, courage had tried to outrun mathematics and lost. Courage was abundant, the final line of the report read again. Accuracy was not. For 5 straight days, the sky over Ploiești did not return to blue. Columns of black smoke drifted east toward the Black Sea, blotting out the sun and turning noon into twilight. From 1,000 miles away, Allied reconnaissance pilots reported the haze like a second horizon. On the ground, the scale of the destruction was staggering. Storage tanks hissed and boiled. Rivers of burning oil snaked through the streets. Romanian firefighters worked alongside German engineers, their faces blackened, clothes soaked with fuel. Entire neighborhoods were coated in soot. Birds fell from the air. For a brief moment, the mission had achieved its purpose. Oil output dropped by almost 1/3. Railway lines buckled from heat. Thousands of tons of fuel were lost. But the victory was fleeting. Within weeks, German and Romanian crews began repairs under floodlights. Replacement pumps and pipes arrived from Vienna and Budapest. By the end of September, the flames were gone, and the refineries were producing again. The immediate impact belonged to the Americans, but the lasting advantage returned to the Axis. At Benghazi airfield, the survivors landed one by one, some on 2 engines, some on none. Ground crews stood silent as the damaged Liberators taxied in, leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid. No one cheered. There was only the smell of oil and blood. A young crew chief recorded in his notebook. They came back without wings, without glass, without sound, just ghosts inside aluminum shells. In the debrief tents, officers collected fragments, film reels, burned maps, bullet-riddled flight logs. The arithmetic was brutal. More than 300 airmen lost in a single morning. The raid had become both proof and warning. For the Allied command, the lesson was immediate. Low-altitude precision against fortified industry was suicide. Air Chief Marshal Tedder ordered all future raids to return to high altitude, supported by long-range fighters. The age of heroic low-level bombing was over. The war would now be fought by instruments and strategy, not daring alone. Still, the men of Tidal Wave refused to see it as failure. In their letters home, they wrote of pride, not defeat. Lieutenant Merrick, who had flown the Sandman, described what he saw when he looked back at the burning city. It was terrible. It was beautiful. For that instant, we believed we had changed the world. Back in Europe, German officers studied the attack in disbelief. Captured American crews were interrogated in Bucharest. One Luftwaffe colonel reportedly told a pilot, "You Americans are insane. No one flies that low over that much fire." The pilot's answer was quiet. We weren't supposed to come back. Across the front, even German newspapers, carefully censored, admitted the raid's audacity. Berlin radio called it Der Wahnsinnsangriff, the madman's assault. But in private diaries, Wehrmacht officers wrote of something deeper, fear. If the Americans could strike Ploiești, the most guarded target in Europe, what would come next? At home, President Roosevelt received the casualty list in silence. He called it a blow both gallant and grave. The Pentagon's analysis concluded that the courage had exceeded the planning. For Colonel John Kane, the man whose group had pressed furthest into the storm, the aftermath was personal. He was found days after the mission, dehydrated but alive, beside the wreck of his Liberator. When questioned about the outcome, he said only, "We proved we could reach anywhere. That's enough for now." Weeks later, he stood on a dusty parade ground in Benghazi as a general pinned the Medal of Honor to his uniform. He didn't smile. Behind him, a row of empty chairs marked the men who never returned. The citation read, "For gallantry and leadership beyond the call of duty." But in his private notes, Kane wrote a different line. "We lost the mission. We won the men." That was the paradox of tidal wave, a disaster that became a symbol. What began as an attempt to cripple Hitler's fuel supply ended as something else entirely, a test of endurance, a measure of what ordinary men could endure when the calculation failed them. For historians, the raid was a tactical failure. For those who flew it, it was the day courage found its limit and refused to stop there. For the men who made it back, silence was heavier than sound. In the mess hall that night, the usual noise of laughter and tin cups was gone. Only the desert wind moved through the open doors of the hangars. Someone had pinned a list to the wall, names written in pencil, many with no check mark beside them. Out of 177 crews, more than 50 would never report in again. The shock rippled far beyond Benghazi. In Washington, the War Department's analysts reviewed the mission in disbelief. The calculations had been flawless, the courage immeasurable, the losses unacceptable. A memo to General Arnold read, "If the same effort were applied to strategic bombing at high altitude, results might equal cost." It was the first formal acknowledgement that the U.S. Army Air Forces had reached the limit of what men could endure. From that moment, the doctrine began to shift. Precision would come not from altitude or instinct, but from machines, from radar, from Norden bomb sights, from mathematics. The war in the air was evolving, and tidal wave had been its crucible. Still, memories of the raid refused to fade. Pilots would wake at night to the echo of flak bursts, the glare of burning oil. One navigator later wrote, "When I close my eyes, I still see the city upside down. Fire above, fire below." Prisoners of war held in Romania and Bulgaria were sometimes shown photographs of the damage. Their German captors called it the proof of madness. But those same guards, off duty, admitted they'd never seen anything braver. In Bucharest, civilians gathered at the ruins of the Astra refinery to stare at the wreckage. A Romanian engineer, interviewed years later, recalled, "The ground burned for days. We said to each other, if they can do this, they can reach Berlin." The psychological toll was mutual. For the Germans, Ploiești became a symbol of vulnerability, proof that no wall of steel could keep the Allies out forever. For the Americans, it became a lesson written in fire. The courage alone could not win a technological war, but it could carry a nation through it. When Colonel John Kane finally returned to the United States, reporters crowded him with questions. Was it worth it? Did it succeed? He paused before answering. "It succeeded in showing what we are made of. That's worth more than any refinery." In the following months, the U.S. 8th Air Force took that lesson to heart. High-altitude raids over Germany became the new doctrine. The B-17 and B-24 formations returned, this time escorted by long-range fighters, protected by planning rather than faith. Each mission carried the ghost of Ploiești in its flight plan. Even after the war ended, the veterans of tidal wave carried the memory like a scar. In reunions decades later, they spoke not of tactics, but of faces. The men who didn't come back, the sight of a bomber disintegrating in the smoke. Some couldn't bring themselves to watch footage of the raid. Others said they still smelled the oil, But when asked if they would have done it again, the answer was always the same. "Yes," said one survivor, "because we believed it mattered." Across the Atlantic, at a memorial near Ploiești, a small plaque now bears their names. It stands beside a rusted pipeline and the remains of a bomb crater filled with rainwater. Each year, Romanian villagers place flowers there, for men who once came as enemies, but left as something larger. The raid that was meant to cripple Hitler's empire did not achieve its tactical goal. But it changed everything that followed. It forced a reckoning between bravery and logic, between ambition and loss. And in that reckoning, the U.S. Army Air Forces learned what no machine could teach: that courage, though costly, was the only constant in war. The mission that was meant to cripple Hitler instead forged the courage to keep going. By the time the fires of Ploiești finally faded, the world had already begun to change. The raid that began as an experiment in courage became a turning point in the science of war. In Washington, analysts studied every detail: the maps, the flight logs, the wreckage. They realized that courage had reached its limit. From now on, precision would decide survival. The lessons of Tidal Wave reshaped an entire doctrine. Low-level strikes, once celebrated for their audacity, were quietly abandoned. The U.S. Army Air Forces turned their eyes upward. From the clouds, at 20,000 feet, new formations of B-17s and B-24s would now attack in daylight, guided by instruments instead of instinct. What failed in Romania would evolve into the strategy that broke the factories of Germany and, eventually, the will of Japan. At the heart of this transformation was technology. Machines that could see what human eyes could not. Radar navigation systems like the British H-2X, known to crews as Mickey, began to replace guesswork. Its circular green screen could paint a picture of the ground even through clouds or smoke, turning the chaos of bombing into geometry. Each flash on the scope meant a target found. Each pulse meant a city spared or destroyed with intent, not accident. The B-24 Liberator itself, once doubted, became the backbone of America's global reach. Its range, proven at Ploiești, would soon carry the war to the Pacific. In 1944, the same aircraft launched from India and China to strike the Japanese home islands under Operation Matterhorn. The men who flew those missions often spoke of Ploiești as their ghost, a memory that whispered every time they crossed an ocean. From failure came refinement. From tragedy came clarity. In industrial war, the line between heroism and waste was measured not in courage, but in calculation. The math of survival had changed forever. In industrial war, one strategist later wrote, "Precision means survival." And yet, precision itself was a fragile promise. Every advancement, the radar beam, the bomb sight, the long-range fuel tank, had been purchased by the mistakes of those who came before. The courage of 1943 became the foundation of 1944. Their fire built the compass that would guide a generation. When peace finally returned, the lessons of Ploiești remained engraved in every oil map and flight manual. The world had learned that oil was more than a resource. It was a weapon, a heartbeat, a target that could decide the fate of nations. From the deserts of Libya to the jungles of Burma, fuel would forever mark the limits of power. In every war that followed, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, commanders would trace their supply lines like arteries, always remembering what happened when they were cut. And somewhere, in the silence after each mission, the echo of August 1st, 1943, still lingers. The roar of engines over Romania, the glow of burning fields, the moment when men realized that bravery alone could not win a modern war. But perhaps that was the point. Because tidal wave was never just about oil or bombs. It was about the transformation of warfare itself. From instinct to intellect, from courage to precision, from fire to control. Those who flew that morning had crossed more than mountains and borders. They had crossed the boundary between the old world and the new. And in that crossing, they left behind a truth that still defines every pilot, every soldier, every commander who follows. Courage wins the moment. Precision wins the war. The last liberators limped home across the dunes of North Africa. Wings torn, fuselages scorched, their shadows stretching long over the sand. The sun hung low, a red disk reflected on aluminum skin, streaked with oil and dust. There was no formation anymore, just survivors chasing the horizon. As one pilot wrote later, his words still etched in the margins of a flight log. We went low to surprise them, and found ourselves in the middle of the sun. For the men who flew through that fire, courage had not been a choice. It had been the only direction left. From the deserts of Libya to the skies of Romania, Operation Tidal Wave became more than a mission. It became a testament to risk, to endurance, and to the line where bravery meets consequence. Subscribe to Battle Records to uncover the untold missions of World War II, where courage met consequence.